This is Dominissimo Voxlore, transmitting in the silence of the shadow in the warp. In this broadcast, we recount the coming of the Great Devourer, the Tyranids, a hunger without limit, a predator from beyond the galaxy itself. From the dead oceans of Tyran to the fall of Ichar IV, from the shadowed spiral of Genestealer Cults to the endless claws of the Leviathan, this is the truth of a species that does not conquer, but consumes. Strike the seal of subscription, or be devoured with the prey that thought itself safe. Steal your will, burn your dead, and bear witness to this decree. This is the voice of Dominissimo, and this is the law of the Tyranids. The galaxy did not hear the Tyranids arrive, it felt them. Long before any fleet sighted a living ship or any soldier faced chitinous claw, a pressure fell across the eastern fringe. A psychic suffocation that turned astropathic choirs to silence and drove sanctioned psychers to madness. The Adeptus Biologists would later name it the Shadow in the Warp. At first it was a rumour, beacons that stuttered and died, frontier worlds that slipped quiet, star charts amended with skull icons and cautious margilania. The earliest footprints of the Predator preceded its bulk. Pure strain gene stealers, apex infiltrators, appeared where no one could explain them, from derelict void hulks to the moons of Imgal, their mutable throats and feeding tendrils already the stuff of sermons. They did not conquer, they nested. They did not broadcast, they infected. Brood by brood, they birthed cults that prayed to a four-armed deliverer and taught their children to love the sky. Administratum clerks filed the outbreaks as isolated insanities. The Ordo Xenos kept notes. Inquisitor Fidus Cryptman was among the first to thread those notes into a line. He traced shipping ledgers, pilgrim routes, and quarantine writs across the Ultima Segmentum, mapping disappearances that aligned with psychic dead zones. He did not yet know the attacker's shape, only that something vast was moving with intent. When the Mechanicus research world of Tyran fell silent, suspicion hardened into certainty. Tyran had been a water world, its equatorial oceans thick with catalogued life. Cryptman's cutter made orbit over a planet that should have glittered blue. Instead, he looked down upon dry seabeds and wind-scoured plains. The outposts were intact, doors sealed, bulkheads locked. There were no bodies, there was nothing that could rot. The emergency cogitator held a handful of corrupted logs and one coherent file, the final minutes of a station that had armed its turrets and braced for boarding. The pics showed silhouettes wrong to a human eye. Ribbed armour plates, scythed forelimbs, eyeless masks that turned as one when the alarms died. Then the recording ended, not in flame or blood, but in perfect black. Cryptman walked through laboratories that smelled of dust, not death. Specimen tanks were empty, yet none were broken. It looked less like a massacre than a harvest. He could name many Xenos that left bones and ruins. None left the world immaculate. On his report he wrote a single word: Tyranids. After the world that had become the first proof. The name stuck because no one who saw Tyran forgot Tyran. Evidence multiplied. Neighbouring systems reported the same sequence. Communications degrade, migratory fauna vanish, weather skews as the upper atmosphere is salted with spores. Then the impact storms begin. Mycetic seeds fall in their thousands, birthing organisms designed for one task each. Skirmishers to flush prey, shock beasts to break lines, and synapse creatures to bind the swarm to purpose. Above, bioships drink the oceans through capillary towers and scrape continents into slurry. When the swarms lift, it leaves bedrock and salt air, nothing that can breed, ferment, or dream. Unlike other predators the Imperium had faced, the Tyranids did not fight for territory, creed, or vengeance. They fought because hunger is a law. Each organism, from a ripper grub to a hive tyrant, was a cell inside a superorganism directed by the Hive Mind. An intellect not housed in a skull but distributed across the swarm. Where that will fell strongest, coordination was absolute. Ammunition never wasted, sacrifices instantaneous, adaptations appearing mid-campaign as if printed from a living foundry. Poison that crippled one brood would be shrugged off by the next. Tactics that shattered a wave would find the next wave shaped to flow around them. The foe learned while you watched it die. To chart the approach of such hunger, Cryptman turned to star maps and arithmetic. He marked dead worlds, quarantines, and trade routes now annotated as unsafe, and found a curve arcing from the intergalactic void beneath the galactic plane. It was not a raid, it was a migration. The Imperium had learned to imagine threats that rose within the Milky Way. Orc empires swelling, chaos tides breaking, Necrons waking. The Tyranids were different. They were an external pressure, a continental shelf grinding toward a coastline that had never known an ocean. News reached Ultramar that confirmed his fears. Patrols at the realm's rim encountered living craft. Vast ribbed silhouettes venting bioplasma and extruding feeder tendrils. Debris fields in their wake held no scrap metal, no bodies, only brittle mineral dust where flora and fauna should have been. The paradise world of Prandium reported equatorial auras and green fires in the forest canopies. Within days its oceans frothed beneath descending hives. If Macragge lay on the Brest's line of march, then Macragge would have to become a fortress. Preparing to resist the Great Devourer was unlike readying for any known war. Vox traffic collapsed under the shadow. Astropaths could not cry for aid without bleeding from their eyes. Logistics officers discovered that anything the Tyranids could eat became a liability. Promethean stocks, agri stores, even the dead. Governors were instructed to burn fields, evacuate livestock, drain reservoirs, and ready cyclonic charges rather than allow biomass to be captured. On fortress worlds, crematoria ran day and night. Naval tacticians rewrote doctrines on the fly. Heat-seeking torpedoes lost lock against carapace that wicked away heat. Plasma washed across bioships that bled and then sealed. Boarding actions, an Astartes speciality, became ambushes inside living corridors that clenched like throats and wept dissolving acids. Void warfare still mattered, crippled the orbital musculature, and the ground battle starved. But commanders learned that every victory bred a counter-revolution, and that killing the right synapse at the right time meant more than any single line held on the ground. For citizens on the frontier, the Tyranids' coming was an apocalypse both intimate and immense. Skies that should have shown constellation filled with drifting veils, spore clouds so thick they turned sunset to jaundice. Rivers slowed as microbial mats altered chemistry. Herds stopped feeding, then they fed on anything. Sirens sounded not for shelter but for pyres. People bought furniture, crops, books, everything that could burn, because every kilogram destroyed now might be a death the swarm could not buy later. Chaplains preached steel over piety. Medicae signed warrants for mass cremation, mercy narrowed to a blade. When the first counterblows landed, when Macragge armed to the teeth, when Deathwatch kill teams purged cult warrens, when Forge World brewed new toxins and trialled new munitions, the Imperium finally saw the Tyranids clearly. This was not a single invasion, it was the vanguard of an ecological event, a tasting tongue extended from a darkness beyond the rim. The swarm that had erased Tyran was one nerve in a vast anatomy. Others pressed from other angles, experimenting with different pressures, learning which nerves led to terror, which to starvation, and which to triumph. In that knowledge is both terror and clarity. The Great Devourer is not a rival empire to defeat and sue for peace. It is a hunger-given method. The first lesson, learned on a dead seabed under a white sun, is simple and absolute. If the Tyranids reach your world, you do not win. You survive by giving them nothing they can use. Time, food, bodies, hope, and by killing them faster than they can learn how to kill you. Everything that follows in this chronicle begins there, with an ocean planet stripped to salt, a name carved from its ruin, and a truth that has haunted every star since. The Great Devourer has arrived, and it has not yet begun to eat its fill. The warning left Tyran with a man who refused to be silenced by empty worlds. Inquisitor Fetus Cryptman broke orbit with a data codex clutched like scripture and burned hard for the nearest astropathic station. The route to Thandros should have been routine. Instead, he threaded a starfield that felt wrong, as if sound had been taken from space. The relay he sought hung intact above a planet without traffic. Docking hatches cycled, lights worked, but every vox was mute. In the comm sanctum he found the answer, shattered amplifiers and a dead choir. He stripped the places for parts, lashed together a crude transmitter, and hammered the same message into the void again and again. A devouring armada is inbound, and the world that proved it had nothing left to bury. That message found Ultramar. Murnius Calgar, master of the Ultramarines, received it in a chamber whose marble told history of victories. He did not call for comfort, he called for maps. Beacons flared to life, trade lanes and patrol loops turned into a predictor's lattice. The lines of advance that Cryptman calculated intersect with Ultramar like a spear. Calgar's decision was immediate. Macragge would not be a way station, it would be a wall. Edicts moved faster than fear. Fortress World shipyards went to 26-hour cycles. Defence silos unlocked codes no one had spoken in centuries. Agri-world convoys were rerouted to seed emergency stocks deep beneath the polar ice where heat signatures would not betray them. The chapters of reserve companies drilled in the corridors of the polar bastions engineers had cut from millennia-old ice. Labyrinths of ferrocrete galleries, fire lanes, and blast doors that narrowed from boulevard to trench to killing box. Orbital pickets spread outward like a net cast into a dark river. Then the river rose. The first contacts were dots that shouldn't have been there, then clusters that shouldn't have grown so quickly. Living vessels, some the size of escorts, others continents, fell into the system not as a fleet array but as a weather pattern. Imperial Navy captains adjusted firing solutions and found their augurs lying to them as mass redistributed inside those things, internal organs shifting to confound prediction. Calgar took command of the void action from the battle barge Octavius and cut the order the crews were waiting for. No heroics, kill density, keep the corridor to the planet open. The opening volleys lit Macragge's night hemisphere with false dawn. Macro cannons punched holes through chitinous hulls that sealed like wounds. Lance strikes cawed beasts that still fell forward while their trailing broods spilled in ragged swarms. When the picket line buckled, the Navy tried an old trick on a new enemy: close and board. Veteran Astartes stormed into living corridors that flexed and clenched, fought up bile-slick ramps, blew open nodal ganglia with crack charges, and withdrew as the ships folded around them like fists. It worked until it didn't, buying hours at the cost of squads and hulls. The hour that mattered came with a name sailors still say with a quiet reverence: Dominus Astra. The ancient battleship was burning stem to stern, its decks a brawl of chitin and ceramite, its magazines spent. Its captain requested permission to disengage and received instead a silence in which he made his choice. He overrode the safeties that mechanically had bolted into the warp drives of wiser ages. He lit the ship's heart. The battleship's death tore a hole in reality itself and swallowed a swath of the Hive fleet, an imploding flower of warp light devouring bioships by the score. The shockwave staggered the rest. In that lurch of opportunity, Calgar drove the surviving Imperial line back towards Macragge's gravity well, shepherding transports and cripples under the guns of the planetary defences. Space was not won, it was made survivable. That was enough to hand the next phase to the ground. Mycetic impacts had already scarred the polar continent by the time the first Thunderhawks came screaming home with scorched wings. From each crater poured living purpose, scuttlers to probe, brutes to break, synapse beasts to bind. The northern and southern polar fortresses, mirror cities of concrete and ice, took the weight. Veteran companies manned the walls in Terminator plate. Lines of interlocking fire spat a storm that turned approach fields into ridges of carcasses. Auspex servitors counted until their logic stacks overflowed, then counted again. The first night was spent learning the rhythm of the enemy. It did not come in waves, it came in problems. Brews that darted into gaps and died taught the swarm the measure of the corridors. The next brews were sized to fit. Lictors slid along ceilings like shadows and found thermal trip lines they could not see, dying in chimneys of Promethean that roared knee-high through murder halls. Carnifexes hit doors the width of cathedrals and cracked them in 3 blows, only to stagger as demolition charges detonated beneath their claws, and power fists fell from the murder slits. When a breach was inevitable, the Ultramarines did not pile men into it. They let the breach happen, and tightened the noose behind it, clearing the incursion with storm bolters at wrist's length and the unanswerable punch of thunderhammers. On the second day, Calgar left the void and walked the snow. He chose the northern fortress first. The southern was holding. He arrived into a firestorm and the report that a synapse node was shaping the attack. One of the towering tyrant forms directing the swarm with needle-precise cruelty. The chapter master took a reserve and pushed through the service galleries, following the sudden absence where the enemy's lesser minds grew clumsy. Snow steamed on ceramite greaves. In the kill court beyond the inner sluice, the tyrant waited among his guard. The duel was short and savage. Calgar's armoured fist cracked bone swords to splinters. Barbed whips wrapped and tightened. Servos screamed as he tore free. The tyrant's talon bit and found the master of Macragge inside it, not the plate. Calgar killed the beast anyway, drove it down and broke its crown, and stood bleeding while his veterans held a ring against everything that came to fetch the corpse. He left the court on a stretcher, issuing orders with a voice steady enough to keep the fortress focused. Reassign the reserve he had led to the southern gates, shift plasma to Gallery 12, do not counterattack beyond the inner doors. He would later wake to find his bones sheathed in adamantium as well as honour. In the south, the defence had ground down to the last doctrine. Ammunition tallies were a prayer. Captain Invictus and the First Company did not ask for relief they knew would not come. They asked for the confirmation that the orbital situation was improving. The reply was not words, but the sudden thinning of spores overhead, evidence that Navy squadrons, those that still lived, had found their teeth again and were ripping down the last of the big beasts above. Invictus acknowledged with a curt click and ordered the inner vault sealed. The veterans took their stations not in the ramparts but in the choke points, the places where a single armoured form could deny 20 metres with a storm bolter and a blade. What followed had been told so often it feels like scripture and yet remains a report. They held. They held when the power failed and they fought by muzzle flash. They held when chitin stacked to the ceiling and the only way to fire was to shoot through the mass. They held when the doors behind them were welded shut and the air grew sweet with burning promethium and salt and blood. At the last there were no Medicae left to tally wounds, only brothers counting each other by voice and then by silence. When relief teams cut their way through the fused metal, they found the First Company where Invictus had placed them. Every man accounted for, every corridor clear, the inner sanctum unbreached. The tally made that day made a museum of the North Fortress and a shrine of the Southern. Behemoth did not break all at once. It frayed. The void action turned from defence to pursuit as scavenger flotillas arrived to help finish what the Dominus Astra had started. On the ground, the swarm starved without command and fresh flesh to grind into more bodies. The furnaces did their pitiless work, denying the enemy even in death. Days later, when the smoke thinned and the sky showed stars again, Macragge stood still. The price was not counted in numbers alone, though those were ruinous. Companies bled white, fleets halved, a dual world in Ultramar reduced to a memory. It was also counted in the way commanders looked at star charts afterward. The Tyrannic War, as scribes named it when the reports were bound, had not been a storm to weather and forget. It had been a measure. The Imperium learned how much it could spend to survive. Everything, and how narrow survival could be. A fortress door, a captain's order, a ship's last light. Cryptman's warning was vindicated and he did not rest. Calgar healed and did not celebrate. Both men, in their separate ways, reached the same cold conclusion as the pyres burned. This was only the opening movement, one jaw of a beast with more to come. The smoke had barely cleared from the skies of Macragge when the Imperium began to grasp the true scale of what had just transpired. The Ultramarines had endured, but the devastation left behind was a message more chilling than any Vox recording. Entire companies had been annihilated, fleets shattered, and proud worlds stripped of everything that made them living. And still, Behemoth had been one tendril of something vaster. Its ruin did not bring relief, it left only questions. Across the eastern fringe, other systems that had once glittered on the star maps were gone. Cryptman's tally of silent worlds grew with each passing month, as scout flotillas dispatched to resupply or patrol returned to report nothing. They found planets intact, orbital stations hanging as though waiting for crews to return, yet without a spark of life anywhere upon them. Oceans had been vaporised, forests digested, mountain valleys scraped clean. Each world was a hollow shell, a mausoleum not of bones, but of absence. For the Administratum, recording the losses was a bureaucratic nightmare. On parchment-thin data scrolls, clerks tried to summarise what could not truly be quantified. All biomass removed. Entire planetary tithes, agri-world harvests meant to feed billions, were erased in a season. Forge worlds on the fringe discovered their mining colonies had gone dark, not from rebellion, nor invasion by orcs or Eldar raids, but by something more complete. These places had been devoured so fully that not even vermin remained. What set the Tyranid menace apart from the enemies of the Imperium had known before was that the end of the war brought no spoils, no land reclaimed, no wealth redistributed. Where the orcs left wreckage and chaos left ruin, the Tyranids left nothing. Even the corpses of their fallen were gone, dragged into digestion pools and recycled into new organisms before the war ended. When Macragge's defenders cleared the battlefields, they found only frozen heaps of ichor and broken carapace left behind by interrupted metamorphosis. Waste of a swarm denied the chance to reclaim its own dead. For the people of Ultramar, the victory was bitter. Prandium, once called the Jewel of Ultramar, had been erased. It had been a paradise world, a garden planet with seas so clear the stars could be seen beneath their surface, and forests that stretched from horizon to horizon. It had supplied food to half a segmentum and beauty to an entire culture. Now, it was a barren rock, uninhabitable, stripped in mere days. Refugees who had escaped before the final silence filled Macragge's shelters with blank-eyed stares, unable to process how their entire world could be so swiftly unmade. The Ultramarines themselves bore scars deeper than flesh. The annihilation of the First Company was a wound to their very identity. These were veterans whose names had been sung for centuries, heroes who carried relics older than most planetary histories. Their sacrifice had ensured the swarm did not breach the polar bastions, but their loss left the chapter hollow. Rebuilding would take centuries, and in truth, those exact warriors could never be replaced. Marnius Calgar, gravely wounded but unbowed, presided over the rites of mourning once he was strong enough to stand. Upon the snowfields of the polar fortress, the Ultramarines built a shrine to the fallen, a mausoleum that stood amidst the ice scarred by the Tyranid claws. It became a place where new recruits would swear their oaths, their voices echoing among the stones-laden memories of warriors who had bought Ultramar's survival with their blood. Calgar declared that every new Ultramarine would remember the cost of vigilance, and that Macragge would never forget the day it looked into the jaws of the Great Devourer. But Cryptman knew remembrance was not enough. He scoured the data fragments from Tyran and Thandros, pored over logs recovered from shattered voidcraft, and examined samples of Tyranid ichor taken at Macragge. The conclusions he drew chilled even his hardened will. The Hive Fleet had not merely struck and failed, it had learned. The genetic material of Behemoth's creatures, when studied, revealed dormant sequences waiting to be activated, counters ready to be born. Where the Ultramarines' weapons had proved effective, Cryptman saw the seeds of resistance already encoded. What would the next fleet look like? Faster, harder to kill, immune to poisons that had worked before? His reports to the High Lords of Terror carried no comfort. Cryptman warned them what had been seen at Macragge was not the whole threat, only its first expression. If one fleet could come from beyond the void, more could follow. The galaxy's rim was vast and largely unpatrolled. How many more tendrils of the Great Devourer were already reaching inward, unseen? The High Lords responded with what they knew best: bureaucracy and denial. The Administratum downplayed the scale of the Tyranid threat, fearful of spreading panic across already embattled sectors. The Imperial Navy lobbied for additional resources, but in a galaxy at war on 1,000 fronts, few ships could be spared. Some generals even argued that Behemoth had been a unique aberration, its destruction proving that the Imperium could withstand such Xenos horrors. Crippen, though, refused to be silenced. Among the common citizenry, the memory of Behemoth became a tale half-whispered. To many, the Tyranids were phantoms, a terror spoken of by soldiers and inquisitors but unseen by most. Yet in Ultramar, and in the sectors that had watched worlds vanish overnight, the name carried weight. Tyranid became a byword for absolute loss. Preachers in shrine worlds wove them into sermons as proof of the Emperor's testing hand. If humanity faltered, the Great Devourer would swallow it whole. The Astartes, at least, did not mistake the lull for victory. Across the galaxy, chapters began to train kill teams specifically for Tyranid encounters. The Death Watch expanded their vaults with captured specimens, studying alien physiology in the hope of finding weaknesses before the next swarm struck. Some apothecaries began to whisper heresy, that the Tyranids might be the most dangerous foe the Imperium had ever faced, not because of their strength, but because their hunger could never be sated, their numbers never exhausted. In Ultramar itself, Calgar issued new doctrines of defence. Fortress worlds were to be prepared with scorched earth contingencies. Agri-worlds were instructed to build concealed shelters where seed, grain and livestock could be hidden from Tyranid harvest. Orbital defence stations were reinforced with redundancies, and void patrols expanded far beyond the borders once considered safe. The chapter master understood what others denied. Behemoth's death had not ended the Tyranid menace, it had simply bought time. As decades passed, the galaxy turned its gaze elsewhere. Wars with orcs, the endless threat of chaos, the slow awakening of the Necrons, all demanded attention. Many within the Imperium began to treat Behemoth as an anomaly, a single monstrous swarm slain at a terrible cost, but slain nonetheless. The Administratum even reduced the scale of its warnings, relegating records of Behemoth to the shelves of the Order Sinus archives. But in the eastern fringe, whispers endured. Scout patrols reported planets where birds no longer sang, where forests stood lifeless and colourless though no fire had touched them. Isolated colonies vanished with no distress signal. Ships returning from the Halo stars carried spores clinging to their hulls, alien growths that writhed and dissolved before they could be contained. Crippen followed these reports obsessively, convinced they were not isolated phenomena, but the string of another swarm. He was right, the Great Devourer was not finished. Behemoth had been only the first hunger to gnaw at the galaxy's edge. In the void beyond, other fleets were already gathering, each one evolved, each one bearing lessons learned in the blood and sacrifice of Ultramar. The First Tyranic War ended in victory, but it was a victory that rang hollow. The Imperium had stared into the abyss and survived, yet the abyss had stared back and adapted. The silence left in Behemoth's wake was not peace, it was the quiet before new jaws closed. And somewhere, in the lightless gulf between galaxies, the Hive Mind was already watching. For nearly 2 centuries after the carnage at Macragge, the galaxy drifted into a fragile calm. The name Tyranid faded from most lips, and in the hive cities of the Imperium, the Great Devourer became half-forgotten legend. Administratum clerks reduced Behemoth to an entry in marginal archives, filed alongside exotic Orc crusades and obscure Eldar raids. To most, it seemed the Imperium had survived the unthinkable and endured. But to those who had seen the shadow in the warp and stood on the walls of Macragge, silence was no comfort. Inquisitor Crippen, ostracised for his endless warnings, never ceased tracing the faint patterns others dismissed. He gathered fragments, lost ships near the Damocles Gulf, astropathic choirs consumed by static, agri-worlds that suddenly yielded barren harvests. To Crippen, these were not accidents, they were tremors before another impact. And then, in the closing years of the 41st millennium, the second storm broke. Where Behemoth had been a hammer, Kraken was a swarm of blades. Rather than massing into one titanic armada, the Hive Fleet divided itself into dozens of tendrils, each striking a different region. Worlds that had survived centuries of war were suddenly cut apart in weeks. Imperial commanders accustomed to vast fronts and measured campaigns found themselves overwhelmed by speed. They could not predict where Kraken would strike, for its tendrils did not march in a line but spread like fire through dry grass. The first clear evidence came from the doomed planet of Ichar IV. For years its underhives had seethed with unrest, workers vanishing, gangs growing into zealous cults. Local enforcers thought it political. Administratum scribes noted economic grievances. Only when the banner of the 4-armed emperor were raised in open revolt did the truth surface. A Genestealer cult had grown unchecked for generations, entwining itself into the very bones of Ichar IV society. When the skies blackened with the approach of Kraken's bioships, the cultists turned on their fellow citizens, opening void shield gates and sabotaging defence batteries. By the time the Imperial Guard regiments deployed, the swarm was already pouring across the plains. The War of Ichar IV became a furnace of blood. Imperial tanks rumbled through seas of chitin, their tracks marred by alien ichor.
Entire companies of guardsmen were dragged beneath waves of Hormigords, their last fires swallowed by sheer numbers. Only the arrival of Marneus Calgar and the Ultramarines prevented total collapse. Calgar, scarred from his duel with Behemoth's Hive Tyrant, led from the front once more. He orchestrated a campaign of brutal attrition, drawing the Tyranids into kill zones, where the Titans of the Collegia Titanica unleashed volcano cannons that cast swaths through the swarm. The battle raged for weeks, a storm of bolter fire and shrieking claws, until finally Kraken's synapse web fractured. The swarm on Ichar IV withered into chaos, its creatures cut down as they lost their guiding will. Victory came, but the planet was little more than ash and ruin. Elsewhere, Kraken's tendrils reached far beyond Imperial borders. In the Eastern Fringe, the fledgling Tau Empire found its colonies engulfed. For the Tau, young and confident in their technology, Kraken was an apocalypse beyond comprehension. Fire warriors fought with discipline, their pulse fire burning through smaller bioforms, but they discovered to their horror that the swarm adapted faster than they could innovate. Armour-piercing rounds that slew a brood one day were useless the next, as fresh gaunts emerged with hardened carapace. Sept colonies were erased, their populations consumed in silence. For the first time, the Tau learned the despair of fighting a foe that could not be negotiated with, and their star maps bore new scars. Entire sectors redrawn not with conquest, but with void. The Eldar too felt the jaws of Kraken. The proud craft world of Iyanden, one of the largest remaining sanctuaries of their kind, found itself in the direct path of a splinter fleet. For the ancient seers, the coming of the Tyranids was a nightmare made real. Iyanden's fleets engaged in desperate void battles, elegant wraithbone vessels darting and firing into seas of bioships. For every hive ship destroyed, another loomed from the darkness. When the swarm broke through, spores rained upon Iyanden's crystal domes, disgorging claws and fangs into the very heart of the craft world. The defence of Iyanden was one of the most tragic stands in Eldar history. Spirit seers awoke their dead en masse, filling the halls with Wraithguard and Wraithlords, constructs animated by the souls of long-past kin. These silent warriors met the Tyranid hordes in bloody corridors where wraithbone shattered beneath monstrous claws. The avatar of Cain himself strode into the fray, a living god of war born from molten fire, and slew countless beasts before vanishing beneath their tide. The Eldar fought with desperation bordering on madness, each slain defender replaced by another soul dragged from its eternal rest to fight once more. Salvation came only with the return of Prince Ural and his Corsair fleet, whose intervention shattered the synapse control of the swarm long enough for Iyanden to endure. But endurance came at a staggering price. Half the craft world's population was gone, and its halls echoed with silence, the dead now more numerous than the living. Across 100 systems, similar tragedies played out. Agricultural planets became barren husks within days, entire subsectors fell into shadow, and countless civilian populations were erased so completely that only empty ruins testified they had ever lived there. The Imperial Navy fought battle after battle, fleets constantly redeployed as tendrils struck unpredictably. To commanders, it seemed like Kraken was everywhere at once, a phantom that struck, consumed, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. The war only ended through relentless attrition. Coordinated actions by the Ultramarines, their successors, and numerous guard armies managed to sever enough of the Kraken's tendrils that its momentum faltered. Unlike Behemoth, Kraken was not annihilated in one grand engagement, but bled to death over 1,000 smaller ones. Yet even in death, it succeeded in spreading fragments across the galaxy. Splinter fleets broke off, surviving in the void, each a seed of future invasions. The Second Tyranic War left the Imperium weakened, the Tau bloodied, and the Eldar mourning, but the Tyranids endured in new forms, ready to rise again. For Cryptman, the outcome confirmed his darkest theories. Behemoth had been brute force, Kraken cunning speed. Each fleet was not just an invader but an experiment, probing the defences of the galaxy. Each defeat was not the end of the Tyranids, but a lesson absorbed by the Hive Mind. In the cold silence beyond the galactic rim, more fleets waited, already shaping themselves into new weapons forged from the failures of the last. The Second Tyranic War was a victory, but it was not a triumph. It was survival purchased at unthinkable cost. Across Ultramar and beyond, pyres burned not just for the dead but for the certainty that the Great Devourer would return. And when it did, it would come not as Behemoth or Kraken, but as something worse. Something that had learned from every scar humanity and its neighbours had managed to inflict. The galaxy had endured a hammer and a storm of blades. The next shadow would fall like a noose. The wars against Behemoth and Kraken had shown the galaxy the sheer horror of a hive fleet descending from the void, but there was another threat, quieter, more insidious, and no less destructive. The Imperium, still reeling from the sight of worlds devoured in days, began to recognise that the Tyranids did not always announce their coming with the scream of falling spores or the glare of bioplasma fire in the void. Sometimes, the invasion began decades, centuries before the Hive Fleet ever arrived. It began with a single creature, a single touch, a single kiss from the claws of a Genestealer. Unlike the thunderous arrival of a Tyranid swarm, the Genestealers were silent saboteurs. They did not conquer by storm, but by patience. Once they embedded themselves in a population, they spread their infection with a terrifying inevitability. Through a psychic compulsion known as the Genestealer's Kiss, they implanted alien genetic material into a host, rewriting bloodlines. Children born of these unions became hybrids, strange creatures whose features were half hidden beneath human skin. At first, their deformities could be mistaken for mutation or illness, but generation by generation, the hybrids became more organised, more devout, until entire communities whispered prayers to an unseen master, the four-armed emperor, an idol that was in truth the reflection of the Hive Mind itself. By the time a cult reached maturity, the host world was already doomed. Its government, its guardsmen, its manufactura, even its churches might already be riddled with secret believers. Then, when the sky finally darkened with the shadows of an approaching hive fleet, the cult would rise. Orbital guns would fall silent, shield generators would flicker off, and armies would discover that half their number had been traitors all along. The Tyranids would not descend upon a fortress, they would descend upon a feast laid open by its own children. Ichar IV had been the most infamous case, but it was far from the only one. As the 41st millennium dragged towards its bloody close, investigators uncovered cult after cult, some centuries old, biding their time until the day of ascension. On the mining moon of Gossir Quintus, the entire ruling council of the colony was revealed to be hybrid scions of a patriarch hidden deep in the tunnels. When the cult finally rose, they held weapons caches, supply lines, and the hearts of the miners. By the time the Astra Militarum responded, the sky above Gossir was already split by descending hive ships. On other worlds, the discovery came only at the last possible moment. The forge world of Gorgonum awoke to find its tech priests sabotaging defence grids, their flesh warped into ridged carapace and claw. Whole manufactura fell silent as work crews laid down tools and lifted banners of purple and bone, chanting hymns in alien tongues. The Tyranids arrived days later to find void shields dead, orbital turrets cold, and billions of potential mills marching willingly into their open jaws. The horror of Genestealer cults lay not in their inevitability, but in the corruption of faith and family. Guardsmen sent to purge cult infestations often faced enemies who were their own kin. Fathers found sons among the hybrids. Sisters of the ecclesiarchy uncovered priests who had led their flocks astray for decades in secret service to the Tyranids. Entire regiments faltered when they realised they were slaughtering not just enemies but their neighbours, their blood, their children. This psychological warfare was as potent as the claws of a carnifex, for it eroded the unity that was the Imperium's last defence. The Ordo Xenos responded with fire and blade. Inquisitors sanctioned exterminators that spared no quarter, raising districts and levelling hive spires if even a whisper of Genestealer taint was found. The Death Watch, that brotherhood of alien hunters drawn from every chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, became the Imperium's scalpel against the creeping plague. Kill teams infiltrated the depths of hive cities, stormed cathedrals turned into cult shrines, and silenced patriarchs before they could consolidate their broods. But the war was uneven. For every cult destroyed, another three seemed to rise elsewhere, too well hidden, too patient, too deeply interwoven with the lives of those around them. Some cults survived for centuries without their gods ever coming. These became vast shadow empires within empires. The cult of the inner worm on the agri-world Nirth spread so deeply into the population that it essentially was the planet's culture by the time it was discovered. The Astra Militarum regiments raised from Nirth carried the taint into Imperial wars, entire companies of loyal soldiers secretly awaiting the signal from their hidden patriarch. When the truth was uncovered, a crusade was declared, but not before those regiments had already sown chaos across multiple battlefronts. Even alien domains were not safe. The Tau Empire, ever proud of its cohesion, discovered infiltration in its septs. Water-caste merchants and earth-caste labourers, exposed to Genestealer infection, spread hybrid lineages within their enclaves. The Tau struggled to comprehend the threat, for the concept of loyalty suborned by alien brood was alien to their philosophy. By the time the infestation was recognised, entire settlements had to be purged by fire-caste cadres armed with flamers and fusion weaponry, the smoke of their own people mingling with the stench of burned chitin. For the Imperium, the rise of Genestealer cults meant that every victory over a hive fleet did not mean safety. A planet could survive the claws and fangs of the Tyranids, only to fall years later from within. Astropaths began to note disturbing psychic echoes across the galaxy, faint pulses of devotion, whispers not aimed at any local patriarch but outward, into the void. It was as if every cult, no matter how isolated, was praying to the same hidden star. Scholars of the Ordo Xenos concluded that these psychic offerings acted as beacons, lighthouses in the warp, drawing the attention of the great hive fleets towards ripe feeding grounds. Each cult was not merely a fifth column, but a signal fire for the Great Devourer. The Imperial Creed taught that faith was humanity's shield, yet in the Genestealer cults, faith itself had become a weapon against mankind. Every hymn to the four-armed Emperor was a dagger in the back of the Imperium, every birth of a hybrid child another brick in the gallows awaiting its world. Where chaos corrupted through excess and temptation, the Tyranids subverted through patience and inevitability. There was no bargain, no promise of power, only the certainty that when the sky turned black, the faithful would meet their salvation in the digestion pools of the Hive Fleet. The Second Tyranid War revealed the cults in terrible clarity, but they had been there all along. They had been sleeping in the underhives, the mine shafts, the work gangs, waiting for the stars to shift. And as more Hive Fleets prowled the galaxy, more cults began to rise in anticipation. The Imperium strategists faced a grim realisation. No world could ever be trusted to be free of the Tyranid taint. Every riot, every seditious sect, every whispered prayer to something other than the Emperor might be the beginning of another ascension. By the dawn of the 42nd millennium, Genestealer cults had spread like a web across the galaxy. Each was unique, shaped by its world and its patriarch, but all shared the same destiny: to herald the coming of the Great Devourer. They were the Tyranids' creeping shadow, and promised that even when the skies were clear, the end could always be inside the walls. Thus, while the galaxy braced itself for the next Hive Fleet to appear on the edge of known space, many Inquisitors and Commanders feared an ever greater truth: that the invasion had already begun. Everywhere, in silence, in secret. One kiss, one family, one prayer at a time. The scars left by Behemoth and Kraken had not yet faded when the galaxy felt a new shadow creeping in. It did not fall from a single direction, nor did it roar like a sudden storm. It came like a tide, swallowing from below and above, enveloping the galaxy in a choking shroud. Hive Fleet Leviathan was unlike anything encountered before. It did not strike as a line of advance, it came as a claw, two vast arms curling inward from beneath the galactic plane, sweeping toward one another as if to clasp the Milky Way itself in a crushing grasp. The first worlds to fall barely understood what had struck them. Isolated colonies on the galactic underside ceased transmission, their silence dismissed by the administratum as warp storms or simple dereliction. But then entire sectors began to vanish. Krypton, still haunted by the names Tyran and Macragge, was the first to connect the reports. This was not Behemoth reborn, nor Kraken resurgent. This was something greater. Leviathan's tendrils did not probe cautiously, they engulfed. On the agri-world of Tarsius Ultra, the pattern revealed itself in merciless clarity. Tarsis was the jewel of the Eastern Fringe, a breadbasket whose harvest fed countless hive worlds. Krypton, studying the advance of Leviathan, realised it would be the swarm's next feast. He sounded the alarm and pulled every string he had left. Astra Militarum regiments were diverted, battle fleets redirected, and even the Ultramarines dispatched a strike force under Captain Iyanden to fortify the planet. But even as the Imperium gathered its strength, the first symptoms of Leviathan's approach appeared. The shadow in the warp smothered Tarsius before the Hive Fleet was even sighted. Vox channels filled with static, astropaths clutched at their temples and screamed, and the psychic noise drove entire populations to madness. Wildlife fled in unnatural migrations, rivers turned brackish with strange blooms, and the night skies rained down spores that thickened air with choking clouds. Leviathan was not simply arriving, it was reshaping the world before its claws ever touched soil. When the swarm finally descended, it was as if the sky itself fell. Mycetic spores streaked through the atmosphere in numbers that blotted out the stars. Rippers bawled across the fields, devouring crops and people alike, while broods of gaunts poured forth in disciplined waves, their patterns of attack shifting in real time as the Hive Mind tested the defenders. The Imperial Guard fought valiantly, their lives reinforced by Ultramarines who struck from Thunderhawks into the heart of the swarm. At first, Lasfire and Bolters held the tide, but Leviathan was not Kraken. It did not bleed from a severed tendril. For every brood destroyed, another adapted and advanced. It was during the Battle of Tarsius Ultra that one of the most infamous Tyranid monstrosities revealed itself, the Swarm Lord. Unlike other synapse beasts, which were grown anew in each fleet, the Swarm Lord was a singular entity, reborn again and again from genetic memory. It carried with it an accumulated experience of countless wars, every stratagem, every countermeasure, every feint learned and perfected across millennia. Where a Hive Tyrant was a commander, the Swarm Lord was a general without peer. On Tarsius Ultra, it directed the swarm with terrifying precision. When Imperial tanks advanced to exploit a breach, the Swarm Lord sent a wave of gargoyles to blind their gunners, followed by carnifexes that tore through their flanks. When the Astra Militarum artillery found a killing rhythm, the Swarm Lord redirected the swarm through underground tunnels, erupting behind the guns in a storm of claws. Wherever Calgar's veterans struck, the Swarm Lord anticipated their moves, countering them with overwhelming force. The battle reached its peak when Marneus Calgar himself faced the Swarm Lord in the ruins of Tarsis Ultra's capital. It was a duel etched into the annals of Tyrannic wars, the Master of Ultramar against the Master of the Hive Mind. Calgar fought with the fury of one who had already seen his chapter nearly annihilated by Behemoth. His gauntlets of Ultramar cracked chitin and shattered alien bone, each blow like a thunderclap. But the Swarm Lord moved with a speed and grace unnatural for its size. 4 bone sabres striking in lethal arcs that tested even Calgar's defences. The chapter master was grievously wounded, saved only by the intervention of his brothers, and the Swarm Lord withdrew, not defeated, but patient, knowing it would rise again wherever Leviathan needed it. Despite such terror, Tarsius Ultra endured. Krypton's foresight, the Imperial Guard's sacrifice, and the Ultramarines' valour brought a victory. Bioships were torn apart in coordinated fleet actions, and the planet's defenders held long enough to drive the swarm back into space. But it was a victory drenched in ash. Tarsius Ultra's farmlands were poisoned, its people broken, and its future as a breadbasket ended. The swarm had been repelled, but not destroyed. Leviathan had only tested its claw and withdrawn. Beyond Tarsius, Leviathan's arm closed even tighter. Dozens of sectors across the southern and northern galactic hemispheres were consumed. Hive fleets did not merely strike planets, they reshaped entire star systems. Worlds were stripped in sequence, their biospheres reduced to slurry and their matter funneled into spawning pools. The swarm moved like a tide, rolling over resistance, fragmenting into countless splinter fleets that spread like a contagion. No single front could contain it. To strike at one tendril was to leave another to fester. Krypton, haunted by the knowledge of what he had seen, made a decision that damned his name forever. He realised that the Imperium could not hold against Leviathan's hunger. Even Ultramar, rebuilt from Behemoth's scars, could not withstand another all-consuming swarm. So he looked elsewhere for salvation. He looked not to humanity's strength, but to its enemies. Krypton enacted what would later be known as the Krypton Gambit, a desperate strategy that would see entire human populations sacrificed to lure Leviathan into the path of another predator. He redirected the swarm into the Orc-held Octarius sector, unleashing a war that bleed both monsters for centuries to come. The High Lords would exile him for this, stripping his name from Imperial record, but Krypton did not care. Better heresy than extinction. The Third Tyrannic War did not end with Leviathan's defeat. Unlike Behemoth that shattered at Macragge, or Kraken bled to pieces at Ichar IV and Iyanden, Leviathan endured. Its tendrils still curl around the galactic plane. Its splinter fleets infest worlds from the eastern fringe to the Segmentum Solar itself. The Swarm Lord still walks, reborn again and again to lead the swarm where the Hive Mind wills. And wherever Leviathan passes, entire ecosystems vanish as though they had never been. For the Imperium, the war was not measured in victories, but in time bought. Leviathan had proven that the Tyranids were not only learning, but multiplying. Behemoth had been brute force, Kraken speed and guile, but Leviathan was inevitability. It was the realisation that the Great Devourer was not one fleet, not one threat, but a tide with no end. The Third Tyrannic War left commanders and inquisitors with a truth colder than the void itself. The Imperium could win battles, it could even win wars, but it could never truly defeat the Tyranids. The galaxy had entered a war of attrition against hunger incarnate, and hunger does not tire, hunger does not die, hunger only waits, and hungers again. Leviathan had arrived, and its jaws had only just begun to close. Krypton conceived a gambit born of desperation. If the Great Devourer could not be destroyed, perhaps it could be fed into a battle that would mire it for centuries. Only one force in the galaxy was savage and numerous enough to meet the Tyranids on those terms: the Orcs. The Green Tide was a species bred for war, and Krypton knew that they would never tire of fighting, never surrender, and never be cowed. To unleash Leviathan upon them would be to create a perpetual battlefield, a furnace that would consume both monsters. The plan began with atrocity. Krypton ordered the extermination of multiple human systems lying along Leviathan's path. Worlds that might have delayed the swarm with their defences were instead scoured by cyclonic torpedoes, leaving nothing for the Tyranids to harvest. He starved the beast deliberately, forcing its tendrils to redirect in search of new prey. Then, using carefully timed exterminator strikes and sacrificial fleets, he lured Leviathan toward the Octarius sector, an empire swollen with Orc life, ruled by the infamous Overfiend of Octarius. It was here that Krypton would spring his trap. The first tendrils of Leviathan arrived in the Orc-held worlds of the Octarian Empire and found exactly what Krypton had intended: a feast of biomass beyond imagination. Octarius teemed with Orcs by the billions, their warbands locked in endless squabbles across industrial moons, jungle death worlds, and fortress planets bristling with crude but brutal weaponry. The Tyranids descended, their mycetic spores raining onto continents already scarred by Orc wars. Rippers flooded across the battlefields to consume fungus and flesh alike, while Bio-Titans thundered through Orc fortresses. The Orcs did not despair. They laughed. Here at last was an enemy worthy of the fight. Warlords raised their banners and gathered mobs by the million, pouring into ships held together by rust and faith in Gork and Mork. Where humans had wept at the sky darkening with spores, the Orcs roared their delight and charged headlong into the storm. The first clashes shook Octarius to its foundations. Tyranid Bio-Titans wrestling Orc Gargants in duels that toppled mountains, swarms of gargoyles soaring through clouds of Dakar jets, while mobs of boys hurled themselves screaming into seas of chitin. What might have been a catastrophe for any other race became the Orcs' greatest game. Every Tyranid assault only made them stronger. As spores fell, orcs simply saw more opponents to smash. Where the Tyranids adapted, orcs improvised, welding new guns, strapping more rockets to their ships, and bolting scrap armour to their hulks. Every defeat was fuel for their fury, every loss an excuse for a bigger war. The orcs were not merely resisting, they were thriving. The Tyranids, however, were not undone. The Hive Mind adapted with its cold precision. Orc ferocity was catalogued and countered. Broods of Tyranid warriors developed thicker carapaces to withstand orc sluggers. Gargoyles flew in denser clouds to overwhelm Dakka jets. The Swarm Lord itself appeared once more, directing the swarm with tactical brilliance that even orc cunning struggled to match. When the orcs massed into enormous hordes, the Tyranids deployed bioplasma artillery that sighed through green bodies in rivers of fire. Where orc gargants lumbered onto the battlefields, the Tyranids sent Hierophant biotitans to tear them apart limb by limb. The war in Octarius became a crucible of constant escalation. Planets were devoured, their biomass fueling ever larger Tyranid swarms, which in turn drew ever larger orc wars. Orcs who survived the battles grew tougher, meaner, more aggressive, their psychic war energy thickening the very air of Octarius. Some war bosses swore they had never been happier, others boasted they were fighting not for loot or glory, but simply to keep the fight going forever. Imperial observers stationed on the fringes of the sector, those few daring enough to remain, reported on the apocalypse with awe and horror. Battles raged that would have shattered Imperial crusades. Entire continents changed hands daily, seas boiled with Tyranid digestion pools one month, then ran green with orc spores the next. There was no peace, no pause, only the endless clash of fang and fist, claw and chopper. The Octarian War, as it came to be called, became a wound in the galaxy, a place where two predators tore at one another in eternal hunger and eternal rage. Cryptman's gambit achieved its goal. Leviathan's full advance into the heart of the Imperium slowed, its attention diverted, its tendrils mired in the Orc Empire. The swarm's pressure on Imperial sectors lessened. For a time, the Imperium could breathe again, but the cost was staggering. Cryptman had condemned billions of Imperial citizens to extermination to make his plan work. Entire worlds were sacrificed, not to the Tyranids directly, but to starvation and flame. His fellow Inquisitors declared him heretic, censured him, and cast him from their ranks. He became a wanderer, stripped of authority, his name cursed even among those who had benefited from his foresight. Yet Cryptman's work could not be undone. Octarius remained the galaxy's greatest meat grinder, where Orc and Tyranid slaughtered one another in a war with no end in sight. Some Imperial commanders looked upon the sector with grim satisfaction. So long as the monsters fought each other, they would not turn their full strength on mankind. But others feared the inevitable. What would emerge when one predator finally triumphed? If the Orcs won, they would be hardened by centuries of unrelenting war, their war energy swelling into something that might shake the galaxy itself. If the Tyranids won, they would emerge stronger than ever before, bloated on the biomass of trillions of orcs and adapted to fight the most savage warriors in the galaxy. The Octarian War became a paradox. Salvation bought with damnation, hope purchased with horror. Cryptman's gambit was no victory, only a delay. And a delay, when faced with hunger incarnate, was all the Imperium could cling to. In the endless battles of Octarius, the roar of the orcs and the screech of the Tyranids melded into one eternal cacophony. Neither side sought peace, neither side knew mercy. And while the Imperium looked away, telling itself the beasts were contained, the truth was far darker. The crucible of Octarius was not a grave, it was a forge hammering something new, something worse, something that would one day break free. The galaxy watched two predators locked in struggle, praying they would devour one another. But deep down, even the most faithful servants of the Emperor feared the truth. Whatever crawled out of Octarius would be a nightmare the galaxy had never known before. The Octarius War raged on in its own corner of the galaxy, a storm of green and chitin locked in perpetual violence. Yet while the Imperium's gaze fixated on that spectacle, the rest of High Fleet Leviathan did not slumber. The Tyranids were not a single spear thrust, they were an ocean, and when an ocean meets resistance, it simply flows around. As Cryptman's gambit dragged one portion of the swarm into the Orc Empire, countless fragments of Leviathan, splinter fleets, fanned out across the galaxy like a creeping infection. These were not remnants, weak and starving, they were deliberate dispersals, each splinter fleet a self-sufficient swarm, carrying the lessons of its progenitor. The shadow in the warp began to flicker across dozens of subsectors. At first it came as a faint pressure, a stifling silence that only astropaths could feel. But soon the signs multiplied. Freighters vanishing without distress calls, isolated colonies found stripped of all life, and agri-world harvest inexplicably rotting in their fields. These were not the hammer blows of Behemoth or the slashing strikes of Kraken. These were scalpel cuts, precise and patient, intended not to merely devour but to spread fear and uncertainty. One such splinter feet fell upon the Tau. Though the young Empire had already endured the terror of Kraken, the new swarms pressed deeper into their territory than ever before. Tau commanders fought with their characteristic discipline, deploying cadres in carefully measured fields of fire, their battlesuits manoeuvring with precision. Yet the splinters were unlike the swarms they faced before. New bioforms emerged, organisms with hardened plates capable of shrugging off pulse rounds, airborne beasts adapted to strike from even above the thin atmosphere of Sept colony worlds, and psychic monstrosities that sent panic ripples through the watercast before battle was even joined. The Tau held some worlds, but at a staggering cost. Others, like Kelshan, became graveyards of failed defences, their skies thick with smoke and the soil churned into alien digestion pools. To the Eldar, the spread of Leviathan's splinters was a nightmare foreseen but still impossible to prevent. Their seers had long whispered of a darkness from beyond the stars, but knowing a doom does not always grant the power to stop it. Craft worlds like Mimira and Malantai felt the claws of the splinter fleets. Malantai, once a proud vessel of the Eldar's dwindling race, fell utterly. A psychic entity known as the Doom of Malantai emerged in its ruin, a monstrous synapse beast that fed on the souls as easily as flesh, draining the spirit stones of fallen Eldar and leaving only silence in its wake. The horror of that loss echoed through the Eldar race, another cruel reminder that nowhere was beyond the reach of the Great Devourer. Even the Necrons, long thought untouchable in their tombs of living metal, stirred in response to the splinters. Some dynasties awoke to find their sepulchres already surrounded by swarms, the Tyranids feasting on the living biospheres above the tomb worlds. Though the Necrons were immune to consumption, the Hive Mind did not turn away. It studied them. On worlds like Thanatos, Necron phalanxes marched from their crypts into seas of Tyranids, cutting them down with gorse fire in numbers unthinkable. Yet the swarm returned, again and again, probing weaknesses. The Tyranids could not devour Necrodermis, but they could deny its resources, stripping away atmospheres, oceans, and prey species until the Necron's necropolis lay isolated on barren husks. Even against the galaxy's oldest predator, the Great Devourer found its way to adapt its hunger. For the Imperium, the splinters were the most insidious danger of all. While Leviathan's main arms pressed from beneath the galactic plane, splinter fleets appeared where they least expected. Some slipped into Segmentum Solar, others gnawed at the flanks of Segmentum Tempestus, and still more wormed their way into the eastern fringe. Each arrival was heralded by the shadow in the warp and followed by a familiar pattern: communication silence, panic, and then screams cut short. On the shrine world of Gaius Point, pilgrims flocked in their millions to honour the bones of a martyred saint. When the shadow descended, prayers became screams. The ecclesiarchy mustered its confessors and fraterus militia, while the Astra Militarum raised hastily formed regiments from the faithful. When the Tyranids fell, the cathedrals became fortresses. Stubbers and lasguns blazed beneath stained glass depicting imperial victory, and relics were carried into battles as banners of defiance. The swarm came on regardless. Mycetic spores fell upon basilicas, shattering spires in showers of coloured glass. The relics of the saint were swallowed in digestion pools as the world's defenders burned with their faith still on their lips. Gaia's Point was erased, its memory surviving only in the furious sermons of preachers who swore the Emperor would one day repay the Xenos in kind. But even victories brought little solace. When splinter fleets were broken by Imperial might, their survivors did not vanish. They drifted, regrouped, and spread anew. Each fragment carried with it the knowledge of battle and the genetic imprints of adaptation. Defences that had proven effective one year failed the next, as new broods emerged to counter them. To commanders, it seemed as though they were fighting the same war again and again, but each time against an enemy stronger, faster, and more resilient. The Death Watch bore the brunt of the counterstrike. Kill teams travelled from one end of the galaxy to the other, purging nests, destroying synapse nodes, and assassinating Tyranid leaders. Yet even they began to sense the futility. They fought not a foe that could be killed, but one that endlessly regenerated. Where chaos could be banished, where orcs could be crushed, where even Necrons could be entombed, the Tyranids only multiplied. Each splinter destroyed was a delay, never a final solution. Some inquisitors whispered a darker possibility, that the splinters were not mistakes or mere consequences of battle, but deliberate dispersals by the Hive Mind. By fragmenting itself across the galaxy, Leviathan ensured no single defeat could cripple it. The Imperium might win wars, but it could never win the war. Every splinter fleet that survived ensured the Great Devourer's continued spread. The Tyranids were not an invader that could be driven back to a frontier, they were a contagion now, a presence seeded everywhere. As the 41st millennium staggered toward its final days, the galaxy found itself surrounded by shadows. Behemoth had been the hammer, Kraken the storm of blades, Leviathan was the tightening claw. But the splinters, these were the creeping tide, unstoppable, inexorable, gnawing from every side. The truth was dawning across the galaxy. The Tyranids no longer needed to arrive from beyond the stars. They were already here, everywhere, splintered into 1,000 hungers, each waiting for the moment when the shadow in the warp would fall once more. And when those shadows converged, there would be nowhere left to run. By the time Leviathan splinters had spread across the galaxy, the Imperium and its neighbours were beginning to recognise a cruel reality. The Great Devourer did not always come as a storm meant to consume everything in one terrible surge. More often, it bled a sector slowly, draining it of its strength, forcing defenders to commit armies to each desperate world. When one planet survived, it was rarely victory, it was exhaustion, leaving the wider Imperium weaker and less prepared for the next shadow to fall. Nowhere was this truth made clearer than in the wars of Tarsius Ultra and Valedor. Tarsius Ultra had already been tested once, during the opening blows of Leviathan's arrival. Though the Ultramarines and Astra Militarum had held the line, the world had never fully recovered. Its fields lay poisoned, its people half-starved, and its defences stretched thin across a scarred and bitter landscape. Yet the Hive Mind had not forgotten. Years later, Leviathan returned, stronger and more cunning. This time the swarm came not as a single assault, but in coordinated waves, each probing the weak points the previous invasion had exposed. The defenders prepared the best they could. Ultramarines returned in force, led by their captain Ichar, while the Cadian 903rd and Krieg regiments dug deep trench networks across the farmlands. The people of Tarsius themselves, hardened by the memory of the First War, armed themselves with stubbers, blades and burning faith. But the Tyranids had learned as well. Organisms unseen before appeared, new strains of gaunts that spat corrosive venom across fortifications, zonothropes whose psychic lances cut through Lehman Russ tanks as though they were parchment, and tunnelling Morlocks that emerged beneath bastions, swallowing defenders whole before collapsing into the earth. The shadow in the warp drowned the planet in despair. Voxlinks stuttered into static, prayers echoed unanswered, and even the stalwart guardsmen of Cadia felt their courage fray. In this silence, the swarm advanced, an exhaustible tide that sought not only to devour but to break the spirit of resistance. Calgar himself, though still recovering from his near-fatal duel with the Swarm Lord, directed the defence from orbit, his mind racing to counter each new adaptation. But for every stratagem he devised, the Hive Mind offered another answer. Tarsius Ultra fell at last, not because its soldiers broke, but because their will could not withstand another war. Its harvests were consumed, its oceans poisoned, its very soil transformed into alien biomass. When the Ultramarines withdrew, they did so not in defeat but in grim acknowledgement. Tarsius Ultra had fought twice and given everything twice. Nothing more could be asked of it. The Imperium abandoned the husk, and the Hive Mind drank deep of its carcass. If Tarsius was a tragedy, Valedor was an apocalypse. The world lay at the heart of a sector caught between two different tendrils of Leviathan, both converging upon the same prey. When the swarms made planetfall, the Hive Mind turned the planet into a laboratory of horrors. Broods clashed not only with defenders, but with each other, each strain competing in a grotesque Darwinian test. The skies of Valedor rained not water but spores and acid, and the soil bubbled with rivers of living ichor. It was as if the planet itself was being reshaped into a weapon. The Eldar, who had watched Leviathan's rise with growing despair, recognised the danger Valedor posed. If the Tyranids succeeded in merging the strengths of two separate hive fleets, they would birth a predator even more terrible than before. Craftworld Iyanden, still reeling from its own brush with Kraken, and Craftworld Bil-Tan, fierce champions of the Eldar war host, formed a fragile alliance to intervene. For once, their ancient grudges were set aside, but they knew the price of failure would be extinction of all life in the sector, and perhaps far beyond. The war that followed was a nightmare beyond imagining. Wraith constructs stalked across fields of living flesh, their ghostly weapons cutting down swarms by the thousands. Aspect warriors charged in perfect formations, only to be drowned beneath tides of gaunts. The skies above Valedor seethed with Tyranid bioships vomiting spores, while Eldar fighters streaked through the maelstrom in desperate duels. At the centre of it all, psychic warfare raged like a storm. The Eldar Farseers poured their strength into unravelling the Hive Mind's command, while Tyranid synapse creatures answered with psychic screams that shattered stone and flesh alike. The turning point came when the Eldar, through immense sacrifice, lured the two splinter fleets into direct conflict with one another. For a moment, the Hive Mind fractured, its unity pulled in two directions. Tyranids turned upon Tyranids, rending their kin in instinctive fury as competing synapse nodes clashed. In that chaos, the Eldar unleashed their most terrible weapons, striking with precision to shatter the planet itself. Valedor was sundered, torn apart in cataclysmic detonation that annihilated both splinter fleets before they could unify. Victory came at a terrible cost. Thousands of Eldar lives were extinguished, Iyanden and Bil-Tan both bleeding warriors they could ill afford to lose. The craft worlds were left weaker, diminished, and haunted by the knowledge that they had only delayed the inevitable. For the Imperium, Valedor was little more than a footnote, an alien world destroyed by alien hands. But to the Eldar, it was a line held against extinction, a desperate gamble that succeeded only because they were willing to annihilate an entire planet to prevent something worse. The stories of Tarsius Ultra and Valedor spread in whispers, each carrying the same bitter lesson. Worlds could fight, and sometimes they could win, but even in victory the price was ruin. The Tyranids did not measure wars as humans or Eldar did. For them, each battle was merely an experiment. A defeat was not an end, it was data to be absorbed, adaptations to be encoded, new weapons to be birthed. Every war that resisted was teaching the Hive Mind how to better kill the next. In the end, what marked these campaigns was not triumph or despair, but inevitability. Tarshish showed that even a world defended by the finest of Ultramar could not stand forever. Valedor showed that even the most desperate alliances of the Eldar could only delay, never destroy what was coming. The galaxy was learning, piece by piece, that the Great Devourer could not be halted. It could only be resisted, world by world, at whatever price each was willing to pay. And so, the name of the Tyranids became a curse upon the lips of soldiers and civilians alike. They were not an army that could be beaten and forgotten. They were a tide, rising higher with each return. For every Tarsius lost, for every Valedor destroyed, another shadow spread across the stars. The Imperium and its neighbours had not yet seen the worst, but the lesson of these worlds ran clear. When the Great Devourer chose a planet as its prey, the planet's fate was already sealed. The only question was how long its death would take, and how much it would cost to slow the inevitable feast. Among the countless organisms birthed by the Hive Mind, some acquire notoriety that outlives campaigns and sectors. They are not heroes in the mortal sense, nor rulers of their kind, but iterations so potent that their names become warnings passed down between regiments. They appear, vanish into the swarm, and then, years later, reappear with the same signature horrors, as if memory itself has been cultured in a spawning vat. To fight them is to learn that the Great Devourer does not merely adapt, sometimes it remembers. The first of these spectres to study is the creature Imperial records call Old One Eye. In every sighting, it is a carnifex beyond the norm, vast, heavily scarred, plated in rigid armour that shrugs off most weapons that would scuttle a main battle tank. Gunners describe shells booming against its chest like rain on basalt. Infantry who faced it report a peculiar rhythm in its advance, not a charge, but a methodical demolition. Walls are not let but removed, buttress by buttress, with claws that bite like cutting torches. When massed fire finally topples the beast, its legend begins. Crews swear that hours or years later, the ground heaves and it rises anew, frozen wounds thawed, shattered plates knotted with fresh chitin, the empty socket that named it still staring, baleful and undimmed. Theories abound, hibernation reflex, redundant organ clades, self-cannibalising repair glands, but the battlefield truth is simpler. If Old One Eye is down, burn the ruin, bury it deep, and do not return. Where Old One Eye is a walking siege, the Red Terror is a disappearance given shape. Tallies fail where it hunts. Platoons lose one man, then three, then a section. Sentries swear they heard wind when there was none, sand shifting where no breeze blew. Survivors recount a flash of pale, laminar flesh and a maw that unhinges to swallow a full-grown trooper whole. At first, command chalks such stories to panic, until they recovered helmets crushed into ovals and lasguns folded at the receivers. The Red Terror does not break lines, it erases them, striking at edges, dragging men under, and leaving commanders to discover that the flank they believed intact is simply gone. The only reliable counter has been to harden perimeters with overlapping fields of fire, and to seed approach corridors with Promethean. Even then, there are cases where it simply does not come, as if the organism knows when a trap has been laid, and chooses to feed elsewhere. It is a lesson the Tyranids teach again and again. Not all their horrors are blunt instruments. Many are scalpels, and the cut isn't noticed until the patient bleeds out. If the Red Terror preys on nerves at the edge of vision, Deathleaper preys on the will to act. Lictors are feared enough, stalking synapse skirmishers that learn a defender's habits the way a marksman learns wind. Deathleaper is something more, a bespoke terror tool the Hive Mind forges when it wants a fortress to fall before the first shot is fired. Garrisons marked by the Deathleaper's passage report patterns that read like a haunting. A gate sergeant vanishes from a crowded mess with no cry and no blood. An adjutant's last message turns out to be a recording of her own voice hours after she died. Patrols fired upon by nothing break formation because they are certain they are flanked, only to find their own blind spots filled moments later by very real claws. Most chilling are the attacks that never land. Dignitaries left alive with scratches on their doors and the taste of chitin in the air. Officers who wake to find their pick slates displaying them sleep. The message is always the same. You are seen, you are reachable, and your choices are already narrowed. By the time the spores fall, the bastion's cohesion is frayed. Orders arrive late because couriers no longer trust corridors. Flame reserves burn faster because jumpy sentries fire at echoes. Deathleaper has not killed the garrison, it has convinced the garrison to spend itself. Then there is the Parasite of Mortrex, a winged horror that turns the defenders' own bodies into ordnance. Where it hunts, Medicaid tents become battlefields. Stings scarcely noticed in the crush of combat, just a hot rasp at the back of the thigh and a sudden weight at the shoulder, flower into agony hours later. patients delirious with fever convulse and rupture, birthing swarms of Ripper that gnaw through bedrolls and canvas to reach the ground. Commanders accustomed to counting ammunition and rations must suddenly count people as potential vectors. Quarantines choke reinforcement routes, foxholes are widened and floored with metal because bare earth births enemies. On some worlds, whole units have submitted to prophylactic cauterization rituals, scars in neat parallel lines where stings might hide, choosing agony now over eruption later. The Parasite turns every battlefield into a prison yard. No one trusts anyone's breath, and every scream in the night might be a nest breaking. Each of these organisms operates at a different scale: Siegebreaker, Line Eraser, Spirit Murderer, Plague, but all share two strategic effects. First, they distort time. A Carnifex that refuses to stay dead forces defenders to fight yesterday's battle again tomorrow. A devouring lurker collapses minutes of warning into seconds. A psychological saboteur steals the day a commander needs to plan. A broodseeder converts hours of lull into sudden crisis. Second, they distort allocation. Faced with Old One Eye, artillery commanders hoard shells better spent elsewhere, just in case. Hunting the Red Terror pulls companies from the true front. Deathleaper's shadows demand escorts, redundancies, and triple checks that slow every decision. The Parasite absorbs Medicae, priests, and logisticians into a containment war no one trained for. The Hive Mind thus wins before biomass is harvested by forcing prey to feed its inefficiencies. What then does effective resistance look like? Reports that Reader's success share certain traits. Against resurrecting broods, victory depends on denial, extreme heat, caustic saturation, or burial under collapsing structures seeded with charges and overseen by Auspex that watch for micro movements. Against ambush predators, discipline in geometry beats valour. Perimeters checked by machine rather than eye, patrols bound by cord and line like surveyors, and kill zones mapped to intersect in depth. Against fear weapons, process is the shield. Orders that are simple, redundancies that are physical, bells, flags, hardwired lamps, rather than purely vox, and rotations that prevent any one officer becoming a single point of failure. Against broodseeders, ritualised hygiene becomes doctrine. Burn pits, line trenches, sealed latrines, and a chain of Medicaid custody as rigid as ammunition accounting. None of these guarantees survival, all of it buys time. There is a final, colder commonality to these legends. They imply continuity. Old One Eye scars reappear in different theatres. The Red Terror's swallowing tricks echo across worlds with no contact. Deathleaper's signature humiliations recur like a calling card. The Parasite's brood cycles match to the hour. Either identical organisms are being printed to the same template, or the same experiences are being reinstalled into the new flesh. The effect is the same for prey cultures. You cannot reassure a regiment that it was only a one-off. The shape of the fear arrives with the name. Quartermasters order extra flame of Promethean not because of a local need, but because there is a rumour Red Terror has been seen 2 continents away. An astropath refuses sleep because a Deathleaper once took a Vox officer from a locked room on a different moon. Myths become logistics. Not even the Adeptus Astartes are immune to that calculus. Chapters that pride themselves on shock assault must draft counter-predation drills when the Deathleaper is reported. Siege specialists who would happily trade volleys with Biotitans lose days to the possibility that Old One Eye is somewhere underneath the rubble they would entomb the rest beneath. Knights who measure war in duels find themselves guarding field hospitals from the Parasite's aftermath, instead of seeking glorious charges. It is not cowardice, it is a triage in a war defined by appetites. And yet, for all their dread, the appearance of such creatures carries a perverse advantage for the galaxy's defenders: pattern. A foe that is everywhere and everything cannot be anticipated. A foe that arrives with a story has at least boundaries. If a Vox officer whispers that the Red Terror is loose, veterans begin lacing the berms without being told. If the Medicae hears the word Mortrex, he sharpens the cautery blades and requisitions metal cots. If One Eye is painted in chalk on a bunker wall, the artillery captain starts the burn plan now, not when the ground shakes. The Hive Mind sends terrors that endure. The prey endure by making those terrors procedural. There is in the end no comfort here, only clarity. Beasts like Old One Eye, the Red Terror, Deathleaper, and the Parasite are not aberrations that the Swarm will forget. They are successes, preserved in template or in memory, redeployed wherever the pattern of prey suggests they will do the most damage. To name them is not to tame them. It is to admit that the war is fought as much in recollection as in fire. The Imperium and its neighbours survive by turning legends into checklists, superstition into standard operating procedure, and fear into a timetable. When the Tyranids choose to send a siege given legs, a hunger given speed, a silence given knives, or a plague given wings, the lesson is the same as it ever was. This enemy learns what hurts you and then comes back carrying that same shape. The only answer is to learn too, and to hope that you can remember faster than the Devourer returns. For all the claws, fangs and monstrous horrors that have scoured battlefields in the name of the Great Devourer, it is not their physical might alone that makes the Tyranids so inescapably lethal. Orcs may match them in ferocity, Astartes in discipline, Necrons in resilience. What no other enemy possesses is the Hive Mind, the psychic will that binds billions of organisms to a singular purpose. To understand the Hive Mind is to glimpse the machinery behind every tyrannic war, to see not beasts, but a living strategy unfolding across the stars. Imperial scholars, from the Ordos Sinus to the savants of Mars, have struggled to define the Hive Mind. It is not a god in the sense the ecclesiarchy preaches, nor is it simply a telepathic net. It is something greater, a distributed intelligence that grows with every morsel consumed, every synapse creature spawned, every victory recorded in alien flesh. To gaze into it, even for a heartbeat, is to invite madness. Astropaths who attempt to pierce the shadow in the warp report not voices, but the absence of all sound, a smothering silence that eats thought itself. Many burn out instantly, others live on only to claw at their own eyes, begging for release from a pressure that never leaves. The Hive Mind projects its will through synapse creatures, bioforms bred not for their hunger but as nodes of command. Hive Tyrants, Tyranid Primes, Zonothropes, the Swarm Lord. These are the anchor points through which the Gestalt consciousness flows. Under their gaze, the swarm moves with chilling precision. Gaunts scything in unison, gargoyles banking as if one body, Carnifex halting their charge at the same heartbeat to pivot toward a new threat. Kill the synapse, and the brood collapses into instinct, tearing at whatever is nearest in blind rage. Yet even then, victory is fleeting. The Hive Mind learns the loss, adapts, and grows a new leader, sometimes within hours. What is destroyed in one battle is reborn in another, reshaped to resist the wounds that had killed it before. The psychic unity grants the Tyranids something no other empire can match: perfect adaptability. Where an imperial army must rely on voxlinks, orders, and the chain of command, the swarm reacts instantly. When a wall of fire halts a brood of Hormagaunts, the Hive Mind sends burrowers beneath it. When defenders anchor themselves with armour, the Hive Mind throws winged beasts overhead, and when commanders hold reserves back to exploit an opportunity, the Hive Mind knows and unleashes its own counterstrike before the opening can be seized. To fight the Tyranids is to be outthought not by a general, but by an intelligence as wide as the battlefield itself. Perhaps most terrifying of all is the shadow in the warp. This is not simply a byproduct of Tyranid presence, but the Hive Mind's psychic pressure projected across entire systems. The warp itself buckles under its weight, astropathic choirs fall silent, demons shriek in sudden panic, and sanctioned psychers collapse as though their souls are being suffocated. To human commanders, it means isolation at the very moment communication matters most. To sorcerers of chaos, it means their god's whispers are drowned beneath alien silence. Even demonic concursions falter under the shadow, for the Hive Mind is not the warp, and it allows no rivals in its hunting ground. Many Xenos scholars, particularly among the Eldar, believe this silence is as dangerous as the fangs of the swarm. To them, the Hive Mind is not merely a predator, but a psychic predator, feeding as much on the energies of thought and soul as on blood and bone. The Doom of Malantai offered a glimpse of this, an organism that drained Eldar spirit stones as easily as flesh, leaving halls filled with empty wraithbone shells. If such a power could be scaled across an entire fleet, what would remain of the galaxy's psychic races? The Hive Mind might not simply consume bodies, it might erase souls. The Imperium has attempted countermeasures. The Adeptus Mechanicus experimented with null maidens of the Sisters of Silence deployed against lesser swarms, their pariah auras cutting holes in the shadow. But such measures are rare, costly, and limited. For every nest purged by blank fields, a dozen more appear elsewhere. Even the psychic might of librarians and Primaris psychers, honed into weapons against demons, falter beneath the Hive Mind's pressure. Against chaos, a librarian may summon a storm of flame. Against the Tyranids, he is lucky to light a candle before the shadow crushes his thoughts into nothing. Yet the Hive Mind is not omnipotent. Its greatest strength, the reliance on synapse, can also be its greatest weakness. Battles across Macragge, Ichar IV and Valedor prove that precise strikes against synapse beasts can unravel whole swarms. The Death Watch specialise in this doctrine, launching kill teams deep behind enemy lines to sever the synaptic web. But such victories are never permanent. For every synapse beast slain, another rises, and the Hive Mind remembers the wound. It returns stronger, clad in adaptations tailored to survive the very weapons that slew its kin. To the strategists of the Imperium, the Hive Mind represents a cosmic inevitability. Unlike orcs, who fight for joy, or chaos, which fights for corruption, the Tyranids fight because fighting is feeding, and feeding is survival. The Hive Mind does not negotiate, does not sue for peace, and does not even acknowledge its prey as anything more than biomass. To it, the galaxy is not a mosaic of empires and cultures, it is a larder. Every decision, every adaptation, every monstrous organism spawned serves a single directive: consume, absorb, advance. The most chilling speculation, whispered even among the Ordo Xenos, is that what the galaxy has faced so far may not even be the full Hive Mind. Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan and their splinter fleets, these may only be tendrils of something vaster still drifting in the intergalactic void. If so, then the silence felt by astropaths at the edge of the Eastern Fringe may not be the voice of the Hive Mind entirely, but only the faintest echo of its true presence. What then would the full weight of its consciousness feel like, if even a fraction is enough to shroud star systems and drive psychers to insanity? In this way, the Hive Mind is more than the Tyranids' weapon, it is their essence. Claws can be broken, ships burned, planets defended, but the Hive Mind endures. It learns, it never forgets. And when one tendril falters, the rest of the beast waits, watching, reshaping, ready to strike anew. To the Imperium, the lesson has been written again and again in blood. The Tyranids cannot be fought as an army, for they are not an army. They are a thought, projected across flesh and chitin, infinite and unending. And a thought cannot be killed with bolters of fire. It can only be resisted, until resistance itself is devoured. In the quiet that follows every battle, survivors speak of the same fear, that in the silence of their minds, in the exhaustion after the guns fall still, they can still feel the Hive Mind, listening, watching, waiting. And they know, with a certainty colder than the void, that it has already begun planning the next feast. The galaxy split, with the opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum, a wound of raw warp energy that tore the Milky Way in half. Every empire reeled. The Astronomicon flickered, half the Imperium was swallowed in shadow, and across 10,000 sectors, order dissolved into chaos. For the Great Devourer, this was not an age of confusion, it was an age of opportunity. As the Imperium scrambled to hold itself together in the so-called Era Indomitus, the Tyranids pressed their advance with renewed ferocity, each Hive fleet adapting to the galaxy's new fracture-like predators scenting blood in the water. No longer did they come in neat waves or singular directions. Splinters of Leviathan, Kraken and Jormungandr poured across the stars, their tendrils darting through the warp storms and into sectors isolated by the rift. Where once an Imperial commander might call for aid across subsectors, the warp's tearing silence made such pleas impossible. Planets cut off from reinforcement faced the swarm alone, and alone they fell. In the Eastern Fringe, the Tau Empire endured what they called the Second Sphere of Terror. Leviathan's tendrils smashed through frontier colonies, consuming them before their defence fleets could even react. Entire set worlds, once proud of their expansion, became feeding grounds overnight. Firecast commanders fought with precision and courage, but the Hive Mind learned faster than their strategies could adjust. Railguns that had once slain Carnifexes in a single shot found their targets clad in denser chitin. Air cadres that had bested Orc squadrons were torn from the skies by flocks of Harpies and Hive Crones. For every Tau victory, a new adaptation emerged, until the young Empire realised it was not winning battles at all, it was merely delaying an extinction. Among the Eldar, the rift was a wound upon an already bleeding people. Craft worlds shattered by warp storms suddenly found themselves in the path of Tyranid splinters. Iyanden, still scarred from Kraken, endured wave after wave of new assaults. Even Macragge, the hidden empire of the Dakari, reported infestations as Tyranid organisms wormed their way into the webway through damaged portals. There, in the twisted dark, Xenos predators met sadistic raiders in wars too brutal for records to endure. Yet the Eldar knew the truth. Every splinter they destroyed was a fraction of something far larger, a tide they could never truly hold back. But it was within the Imperium Nihilus, the half of the Empire cut off from the Emperor's light, that the Tyranids carved their greatest feasts. Hive Fleet Hydra, infamous for resurrecting itself from the corpses of its foes, spread like wildfire. Wherever guard regiments fought it, the biomass of their own fallen became the fuel for new swarms. Worlds that should have resisted for months fell in days, their defenders unwittingly feeding the predator with every death. Hive Fleet Kronos followed a darker path. Drawn to the energies of chaos that spilled unchecked across the rift, it became the Tyranid's blade against the demonic. Where the warp bled into reality, Kronos descended. Its creatures adapted specifically to slay demons, their weapons designed not only for flesh, but for entities of immaterial essence. Across demon-haunted sectors, Imperial survivors reported the unthinkable. Tyranids and chaos locked in mutual slaughter, with mortals caught in the middle. Kronos did not hate the warp as humanity did, it sought only to silence it, to clear the galaxy of psychic noise so the Hive Mind could reign unchallenged. Yet its presence offered grim reprieve. For wherever Kronos battled demons, mortals found themselves in a temporary oasis, spared from one horror only to face another. Meanwhile, other splinters showed their cunning. Hive Fleet Jormungandr mastered subterranean warfare, appearing beneath fortresses thought impregnable. Hive Fleet Gorgon perfected rapid genetic shifts, countering poisons and toxins within hours of first exposure. Each new strain was another lesson learned, another answer that the galaxy had unwittingly taught the Great Devourer. Amid this darkness came the Indomitus Crusade. Rabuti Guilliman, reborn Primarch and Lord Commander of the Imperium, led fleets across the stars to reclaim what had been lost. His warriors fought Tyranid swarms on 100 worlds, wielding new Primera Space Marines and war machines fresh from Belisarius Caul's forges. Entire Crusade fleets hurled themselves into the shadow, burning planets rather than letting them be devoured. On some worlds, the Emperor's returned son personally directed the war, his strategic brilliance matching the wits of the Hive Mind itself. Yet Guilliman knew, as Cryptman once had, that there were no victories in the truest sense. They were holding actions, bought with blood, so that the Imperium might endure another day. The most chilling reality of the Indomitus era was this: the Tyranids were no longer a threat approaching from without. They were within. Hive fleets pressed not from the edges of the galaxy but from its very heart, splintering into sectors once thought safe. The shadow in the warp now fell across systems that had stood unchallenged for millennia. Hive ships were reported even near the Segmentum Solar, their presence raising fears that Terra itself might one day hear the silence of the Hive Mind pressing against the throne world. And yet, despite the devastation, a darker whisper grew among scholars and inquisitors of the Order Xenos. Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, Hydra, Gorgon. Each of these fleets had been immense, but each had also been fragmentary. What if these were not the whole of the Tyranid race? What if they were only the vanguard? If the true bulk of the Great Devourer still drifted in the void between galaxies, then everything the Milky Way had suffered so far was only the probing touch of an ocean not yet arrived. The galaxy might be drowning, yet the real tide had not yet broken its shores. The Indomitus era is, for humanity and Xenos alike, an age of desperation. For the Imperium, the Tyranids are one predator among many, yet one that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be bribed, cannot be corrupted. For the Eldar, they are an echo of a doom long prophesied, one even the gods cannot stop. For the Tau, they are proof that technology alone cannot shield a young race from the hunger of the cosmos. And for the Orcs, they are the greatest fight imaginable, one that grows more glorious and more catastrophic every day. As the galaxy burns, the truth stands clear. The Tyranids will not stop. Not for terror, not for chaos, not for gods nor kings. They will eat until there is nothing left. And when silence falls at last across the stars, only one question will remain. Was this the end of the galaxy, or only the beginning of the feast? You have heard the transmission of the Great Devourer, the Tyranids, hunger incarnate. Their claws leave only silence, their shadow smothers hope, and their hunger is eternal. Strike the seal of subscription and return for the next broadcast of Dominissimo Voxlore, lest the swarm take you unprepared. Guard your faith, steel your fire, for the Great Devourer is not finished, and neither are we.